Welcome back, and we're going to talk about our next chapter in the book, freedom. Now, freedom and the limits of government, or limits of rights, right? The question here is, where do we, or where should we, draw the boundaries between government authority and individual freedoms? Now, I want to note here, like I did in the last chapter, that this author's view is strongly rooted in a contemporary Western democracy. And that means that certain assumptions about what rights we have are going to be built into this. And we'll tease those apart as we move forward. But it is an elucidating and illuminating discussion nonetheless. So one thing to point out is the basic political philosophy of the modern contemporary Western world is liberalism. Liberalism here not meaning liberal in the sense of, say, United States politics. The liberal view is that government serves only to enhance and protect freedom. That is, what a government should do is not regulate every activity of human life. All it needs to do is protect us from one another, from outside threats, provide a sort of minimal sense of what needs to be done here. And in fact, if you take it very minimally, as it was taken originally, what you end up with is a government that does almost nothing except for provide a police force and enforce law, right? And as well as a military for self-defense, right? The idea here, though, and this is shared by all liberals, and most liberals are, let's say, more substantive liberals now. They adopt a larger governmental position. They're in favor of a larger government, anyway. But the basic principle is that some elements of human freedom should be beyond government control. Some very popular limits here are going to be things like religious freedom, so my religious practice is beyond the government's control. Freedom of speech, so I can say whatever I want. Freedom to have property, right, beyond the government's control. They can't just take my stuff. Freedom of employment, they can't make me do something, right? They can't enslave me, effectively. And this is the dominant political view, dominant political theory of the West today. Now, of course, this is not shared universally, right? Communism is not a liberal political view in this sense, right? Even though it gets called liberal in the United States rhetoric, that is not what this word means. Right? This word is specifically about a very limited view of government. But it is one that in the modern world has started to take on more substance. That is, where initial, what we call classical liberals, had a very small picture of government in mind. As the world has advanced and as things have become more intertwined, the view of what is required to protect and enhance freedom has changed somewhat. And so the government takes on more responsibilities in the contemporary world, as is typically the case, right? So if we look at the highway system in the United States, right, the federal government maintains our highway system. That's a pretty significant intervention, actually. That's in every city and every state, right? The federal government regulates radio transmissions. The federal government regulates food quality, the FDA and the USDA. And these are all seen by proponents of these groups as ways to protect and enhance freedom, right? Freedom of commerce, freedom of movement, freedom of speech and communication, freedom to not die. That's the sanctity of life, right? The freedom of life is probably one of the most basic. But there are critics, of course, who challenge this. And exactly how we should draw the line between what it is okay for a government to do to protect and enhance freedom and what crosses the line into doing too much is most of what we're going to be talking about for the rest of this lecture. There are two major questions about freedom. The first, what is freedom? And the second, or what are its proper limits? That is, where does the boundary stop? In looking at our first question, what is freedom, we can draw a couple of distinctions. Something you've probably learned by this point in the semester is that philosophers love to divide things into categories. So we can talk about internal and external freedom. Internal freedom being the ability to make choices, something of a psychological freedom. This might be limited by things like narrow education, or propaganda, or brainwashing. And then external freedom is the ability to make choices in the world. This could be limited by force, cost, or law, right? So internal freedom is going to be something that lets me decide between cheesecake or apple pie. External freedom is going to be actually having the choice, right? So I can decide that I want apple pie, but if I go to get it and someone blocks me with force, right? If someone pulls out a gun and says, take the cheesecake, well, now my external freedom has been limited. We can also distinguish between negative and positive liberty. A negative liberty is my options not being blocked. That is, there's nobody standing in between me and the apple pie. something like this with freedom of religion, right? There's nobody stopping you from going to church. And the government should protect these. That's the idea, right? So a negative liberty is one of these things where we need government, or if we do need government, right? That's a big question and an assumption of this text. But the government will protect our liberties by preventing people from blocking our choices. A positive liberty, on the other hand, is the freedom to have access to options. So if I walk into a grocery store and there's cheesecake and apple pie, someone blocking my way to the apple pie is violating my negative liberty. But if I walk into a grocery store and there's only cheesecake, then my positive liberty to access apple pie has been violated. Good examples of more serious instances of positive liberty are going to be things like right to healthcare, right? Which is prominent in the United Kingdoms, Canada, and now in the United States. Right? Sort of universal healthcare system, right? That every citizen has a right to access medical treatment when they need it. This is one of those places where the perspective of the author comes in this sense, right? They talked about very much as these as being basic liberties. But it's not clear, right? If you look at how hard fought the battle was in the United States, you'll see that a lot of people believed that this was not a substantive liberty. And in fact, many people really only want to focus on negative liberty, right? Freedom from oppression, freedom from being interfered with, rather than freedom to do stuff, freedom to have access to various goods. Now, this is interesting because in some sense, when you enforce positive liberty, you might be taken as sort of encroaching upon negative liberty, right? I have the freedom to not offer apple pie, and now they're making me do it, right? I have the freedom to not serve somebody if I don't like them, but now they're making me do it. So this is one major tension between these two kinds of liberties, negative liberties and positive liberties. Negative liberties which the government protects, and positive liberties which the government enhances or provides, right? So positive liberty, all people have access to education. Negative liberty, all people have a right to be safe in their own home, right? Or have a right to not be robbed, might be a better way to put it, right? But if you make one of these circles too big, it will start eating at the other. And so this is one of the fundamental tensions when we deal with freedom in a modern context. How much freedom are we supposed to have, and what kinds? This brings us to our next question, which is very much, what are the limits of freedom? If we have too much freedom, we just don't have a government, right? If you're free to do whatever, but too much negative freedom, right? Or if we have too few regulations, right, there's no government at all. Some things we should not be free to do, right? I should not be free to dump radioactive material down the drain. That's a bad idea. People will get very sick. And so one of the difficult challenges of these modern liberal governments is to establish which freedoms or which actions should be protected. One standard here is to look at what are called self-regarding actions. That is, these actions only influence me. And there is something plausible there. This is the idea that your rights end where mine begin. You've probably heard some version of that expression. But there's a problem here, right? So let's say someone's using cocaine. That seems like a self-regarding action, if anything is, because they're just putting a substance in their own body. Assume that they're not going out, they're not hurting anybody, they're just doing cocaine in their own house, right? They're sitting in the recliner and doing cocaine and playing video games or something. However, they're hurting their body in the process, meaning they're actually going to increase the medical care that they're going to need. If we provide a medical system, or even if we don't have a government-provided medical system, but just granting that we have a limited amount of medical resources, they are making themselves need more. They're also going to have trouble doing their jobs, and they may interact in various unpleasant ways, right? So one thing that's fuzzy is that this basic principle of self-regarding actions, things that only impact me, is actually really hard to demarcate. It's actually really hard to find an action that is a paradigm of something that only affects me and not others. If I eat a Big Mac, right, or if I eat a bunch of fast food, I'm contributing to the fast food business, right, and whatever corporate system I'm part of, which means I'm contributing to the perpetuation of certain standards of employment, which may or may not be problematic. I'm worsening my health, making it more likely that I'm going to need medical care in the future, and arguably less effective at certain kinds of jobs, right? I'm doing a whole bunch of things all at once. Driving to work, even, right? I'm making my decision, but I'm pumping CO2 and other pollutants into the atmosphere when I do that. So the idea of self-regarding actions, while a good intuition pump, like a good base place to start thinking, isn't necessarily going to give us the kind of clarity we would like regarding what we should be free to do. Another key idea involved in this concept is offense versus harm. Right? So the idea here is that self-regarding action is one that does not harm anyone else, but it might offend you. And it's hard to define a clear distinction between these two concepts. But the one the text gives is something effective. Offense is a subjective property based on your beliefs and attitudes, whereas harm is an objective damage to body, your economic property, that sort of thing. However, there are lots of boundary cases that make it hard to distinguish between these two. While it's clear that I'm harming you if I take a 2x4 and hit you over the head, and it might just be offending you if I use the word moist, which people hate, right, for some reason. Ugh, that word, moist. Probably not harming you, though. There's a great deal of middle ground, which is difficult to deal with. And a lot of it comes from a sort of sensitivity about the way that human psychology works. That is, words can hurt. Clear instances of this, something like hate speech, right? Someone standing on the corner yelling at you because you're a different race than them. I mean, it's offensive, definitely. And it's probably harmful, right? At least psychologically harmful. And it might make you pursue different economic opportunities or avoid pursuing economic opportunities you might have been available to, right? If you go into a workplace and you go to meet your future employer and they just throw out a whole bunch of racial slurs about people like you, you're probably not going to work there. That might be economic damage, right? That might be genuine economic harm. The text gives a couple of ways that we might try to distinguish between these things. So it's not just an idiosyncrasy that you're offended that might make it harm. A great deal of different, like you'd have to change your behavior a lot or take on harm to avoid it, right? And these are good guidelines, in a sense, right? They're good sort of heuristics, but they're probably not going to give us a clear and definite line between offense and harm. And this is one of those things we actually see a lot about today. And it's a pretty prominent political issue on campuses about how careful we should be about offending people, because sometimes offense is harm. Not always, but sometimes. Take, for instance, a political theory class, right? If we were to really be going into this, or an ethics class, people are going to be disagreeing about sacred values and probably offending one another at various points. Talk about race and gender theory, and people are definitely going to be getting offended. And quite frankly, that's probably the right reaction, because these are issues where offensive facts are facts, right? There are just offensive ways, those ways the world is. The world should offend you to some extent, right? But when we're debating with one another, we have two contrary values. On the one hand, we have this idea that discourse and discussion is inherently valuable, and the free academic discourse is one of the most important principles of the academy, of schools in general. On the other hand, we have this view that we should not cause harm to our students, and we should not cause harm to one another, right? Or allow our students to harm each other. And so we find this delicate line where, especially when you're dealing with difficult issues, right, like we do in philosophy, like you do in political theory, like you do in race theory, like you do in gender theory, like you do in psychology, right? When you're talking about, for instance, whether or not somebody's point of view is reasonable or rational, or if it's indicative of a psychological disorder, right? Claims there may be offensive, probably are going to be offensive. And so there's a very delicate line that we have to walk as we teach, as we are students, and as we are participants in a society that appears to value freedom, between demarcating mere offense and harm, or harmful offense, right? Because it does seem clear to me, at least, and you may disagree, but it does seem clear to me that there are some extremes at which offense becomes harm, right? If someone's just berating you constantly, if someone is actively promoting for the extermination of your people to your face, right? Or specifically, they're doing it in a workplace. That's even worse, right? Because now they're pushing you away from an economic opportunity. constant harassment is probably a case where offense crosses to harm, right? Someone who's calling you constantly and telling you how much you suck or what have you. Usually they're much more vulgar than that. But on the other hand, if we block all offensive statements, right? First, we won't be able to talk about true history, because history is offensive to various groups of people, right? And secondly, we just won't really be able to talk about anything of substance, because things of substance matter, right? And when things matter, that's when it's easiest to become offended. So this is another challenge we need to deal with when we deal with freedom, because where do we draw the boundaries of how much freedom we should have? Generally, it's agreed upon that something to the effect of your rights and or mine begin, and vice versa, right? We don't impede on one another. But the question is, what kinds of actions constitute impeding upon one another's freedom, encroaching upon one another's freedoms? What kinds of actions, and this is the category we usually refer to by harmful actions, what kinds of actions are harmful actions, and which ones are merely offensive? Another critical issue for freedom views to take, views that prioritize the concept of freedom, is what constitutes a right. Now, the first thing that we might want to do is categorize two different kinds of rights. Universal human rights on the one hand, and sort of citizen local rights on the other, right? I have a right within the United States to, let's say, own a firearm, right? I have that right. Is that a universal right? Is that something that all humans have to have a right to be able to live a good life? Maybe, but probably not. Compare that to something like the right to free speech. That looks much more plausibly like a universal right. The right to not be murdered? Way, way more plausibly, almost certainly a universal right. The right to wear any color I want? I don't know. Maybe just a local thing, right? Maybe that's just a citizenry right. So this concept of rights gets thrown around a lot in political theory and in political work, right? I have a right to this. I have a right to free speech. You're imposing upon my First Amendment right. In the United States, almost any time someone says that, they're wrong, by the way. It protects you from the government, not from other people disagreeing with you or yelling over you. It protects you from, the government coming in and locking you up because you said you don't like them. It doesn't mean that people have to like what you say. Anyway, sidebar. What counts as a right is a serious debate, if there are even rights at all. Right? There are some theorists who believe the whole construct of rights is merely a legal construct. That it would be to say that there are no human universal rights. Whatever rights exist are just features of governments. That is, they're whatever governments say your rights are. Right. So that's our next question. Are there any human rights, or are they all just citizen rights? And finally, another interesting question, one that your text doesn't address, is do social groups have rights? If you look at things like the charge of cultural appropriation, the idea that you've stolen a sacred symbol from a group of people and used it for your own benefit, so clothing companies that use sacred Native American symbols to sell as fashion, for instance. Some people constitute this as a harm and as wrong having been done. And some people go further to say that the community's rights have been violated. That is, the community, the Native American community, particularly whichever community this symbol was sacred to, because Native American populations are not a monolith. They have various tribes with their own distinct cultures. But particularly that they have some sort of right to property or cultural ownership over this that is being violated. That this is being stolen, in a sense. This is a particularly interesting question because if social groups have rights, they can not just make claims against one another, they might be able to make claims against the people within them. And that leads to a whole new level of interesting thoughts. And one, unfortunately, we won't have time to get into this year. But one that is worth thinking about going forward is if social groups have rights, and does that mean they can make claims against me for violating the government's rights? Can I be hurting America in a sense that I am violating the rights of the country itself? If so, there are going to be some really interesting consequences there. That I will have certain moral obligations to be respectful to my government in the same way that I have a moral obligation to be respectful to my fellow human beings, right? And so that's going to be an interesting concept to think about. So with that, that is the last chapter we're going to have time to talk about this year. It's unfortunate that we won't be able to talk more. I guess it isn't terribly surprising because we ended up with all those technical problems at the beginning of the semester, and we're actually about just as far behind as we ought to have been, in the sense of we're almost on schedule, just shifted. I want to thank you all for putting up with all of the tremendous amount of technical problems we've had. You put a class online and you just quadruple the number of technical difficulties you encounter in a class. And this is my first, or has been my first semester teaching online. I really enjoyed it, though I, of course, did miss getting to know you guys personally. That's one of my favorite parts of teaching. I do feel like I picked up a little bit from you guys as I've been grading letters and going through the discussions, that I've gotten to know you a little bit there. I do wish I could have gotten to know you more. I hope that you enjoyed this class and found it rewarding. I hope that you found important lessons in it. I do recommend that you complete reading this short textbook if you get a chance, because it is a good book, even though it does have some strong biases in it. And I hope that you keep reading and engaging in philosophy generally. I really do believe that a purposeful, well-thought-out life is extremely valuable. And I think that's one of the chief values of philosophy as a discipline, is that it helps us achieve that. With that, I just want to say thank you for everything. I look forward to reading your final papers. Take a look at the syllabus, rubrics, and guides section if you want to see exactly what's expected of you there. And I'll guess we'll be in touch. Thank you so much for a wonderful semester. Have a wonderful day, and I hope that you enjoyed this class. Oh, also, you should be getting emails soon asking you to rate this class online. That's actually pretty useful information, not just for me, because they do give that information to me, though I won't have your names or anything, so I know how to improve my class moving forward, but also for the department. It helps them inform hiring decisions, helps them decide if they're going to keep offering online courses, that sort of thing. Well, with that, I will say goodbye. It's been a pleasure getting to talk to my camera and hear from you guys online. And I hope you have a wonderful summer, a wonderful end of the semester, and an easy exam season. Goodbye.